Hi, my dragons. So here we are with part 2 of Psych and Law. Oh my goodness, I forgot which video I was on. Of our intro lecture. So I want to talk about jury nullification, and that is in U.S. versus Doherty. So usually in the class I will say to the students, who knows what jury nullification is? And most of the time, almost 100% of the time, nobody knows what that is. So let's start with the letter of the law, the spirit of the law. These are two things that oftentimes come into conflict with each other. The letter of the law is the law that is written. So the law that is part of the Ohio Revised Code or Massachusetts Revised Code or Tennessee Revised Code or whatever. It is actually the law that is codified or written. The spirit of the law is, in essence, what the written stuff is trying to capture. The fairness, the justice, the application, all of that sort of thing. And as we know, sometimes those don't mesh. And when they don't mesh, then we have issues, okay? So there's a mechanism called jury nullification, which a lot of people don't really know about, especially juries, and that's very, very concerning, okay? So jury nullification has its history or its roots in British law. And in Britain, the Quakers sued to have an assembly to practice their religious beliefs. They ended up suing, and they won. Okay, so it was something that was carried over from British law, like all of our law. Then we saw it again historically in John Peter Zenger trial, which I don't know if how much you covered about that in American history. John Peter Zenger was a publisher, and he published a newspaper, and this was during the time of the colonies, and he was notorious for publishing what he felt about the British in the colonies. So he became a target of Britain because he was doing things that they considered libelous and seditious and inciting to overthrow the British government, which, as you know, it reached a head during the American Revolution. But nevertheless, John Peter Zenger in 1735 was charged with seditious libel for publishing his newspaper, which criticized Britain and the governor of New York. And he said that juries should have a right to nullify or to discount the law because it violated the spirit of the law. Also, during that time, there was a system in place where the colonists weren't assembled into a jury. So if a colonist committed a crime, then they would be heard by jurors picked by the British, which did not fly well with the colonists. So anyway, during that trial, the jury refused to convict John Peter Zenger. Freedom of the press was born. And they also said, you know, newspapers are there for a free press and they should be able to criticize when that's appropriate. And juries also historically have used jury nullification to not charge people who were helping slaves escape. And we saw it very recently with, there was a man who was acquitted under jury nullification when he tried to help people who were crossing on the border by giving them food and water, and he was arrested, and then the jury was given jury nullification instructions, and they said, no, let him give water to people and food. And so he was acquitted under jury nullification. So jury nullification instructions are, given to nullify the letter of the law and uphold the spirit of the law, because those two happen to be conflicting. So, U.S. versus Doherty, let's get back to that one. U.S. versus Doherty was a case in the 1960s. You know, we protested everything back then. And in the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese would hide in the jungles, in the trees, and in the bushes, and they would ambush the Americans as they came in. And the Americans didn't like this, so the military contracted with Dow Chemicals. And Dow Chemicals created this agent that defoliated the jungle. Okay, so it took off all the leaves off the trees and everything, killed essentially the jungle, and then we could see the Vietnamese guys who were waiting in ambush. So anyway, they were making this defoliant, and hence Agent Orange. It was a defoliant as well. So this group of Catholic priests decided they didn't like that, and they thought it was a crime against nature, and they decided that they were going to protest at Dow Chemical Company. So what they did was they went in and got buckets of blood, pig's blood from a slaughterhouse, and they broke into Dow Chemical headquarters, and they threw that blood all over the place. It was a sign of protest. And well, Catholic priests aren't really good at being criminals, so of course they were caught, and they went to trial. And during the trial, their lawyer said that what they did was an act of consciousness, and that jury should be given nullification instructions, because as an act of consciousness, they should take into consideration that these priests were just expressing their disapproval of the military. And the court first said, no, we're not going to allow nullification instructions, because the jurors don't need it, because everyone in the country knows what jury nullification is. And usually when I set this up in class, I will ask everyone who knows what jury nullification is, and no one says that they know what it is, hence disproving the Supreme Court's statement that everyone knows what jury nullification is, because they don't. Pure and simple. So that was a very interesting case, the case of U.S. versus Doherty. Moving on to the 3 columns of forensic psychology. They also follow the 3 columns of general psychology, which is experimental or research psychology, clinical psychology, which deals with mental health and their applications, and then applied psychology, which is in every single branch of psychology. So in research psychology, also called experimental psychology, people there usually work in labs, law schools, universities, private government agencies, and think tanks. So researchers they do research. I mean, I know a lot of students do research in research methods class, and they have 15 weeks to complete it, and they think it's insurmountable, and it is when you're first learning research. But research psychologists crank out research like every day, running study after study after study, analyzing data, publishing the results, and writing up what we call white papers. And a white paper is something that is given to agencies or courts to show where science stands. Sometimes you see it in an amicus brief, which means friend of the court. And an amicus brief is meant to show where a particular organization stands on a particular topic. So if there's a topic that's in contention, let me give you an example of one, like should gay people be allowed to adopt? So on that case, which was presented to the Supreme Court, the American Medical Association gathered all the research about parenting and presented it to the Supreme Court as an amicus brief. So it was the amicus brief from the American Medical Association, which contained all the research from the research psychologists. So that's an example of what they do in research. And I will say that every single branch of psychology does not advance without research. Even clinical psychology, where you look at different therapies, different diagnoses, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, is based on research. See how that middle word is statistics? That comes from research. Okay? So we don't know anything about diagnosing and treatment or anything until you have the science or the research in back of it. So some of the examples I talked about in the paper that you're looking at was neuropsych. We do research all the time in neuropsychology. That's how we find out what happens with head injured patients and substance abusers who might have brain damage or any of those sorts of things. Cognitive psychology, how people think, attitude formation, persuasion, all the political messaging, advertising, all of that is under cognitive psychology. Threat assessment, a really big one. Especially today, threat assessment is all of the research that backs up how we perceive a threat, how we decide to make a threat assessment protocol, how we carry out these protocols, what we do in times of threat, all of those kinds of things. So research and threat assessment is really, really important. And the Secret Service is the ones that started threat assessment, and they basically did it through research. They love to hire people right off the bat who want to do research-oriented sort of behaviors, and I worked with them on threat assessment and threat assessment procedures and how to build the threat assessment class, which I wrote last year. And that'll be written for the spring semester, I believe, for anyone who wants to take it, which is a great class to have as part of your curriculum. I worked on a case, a trial consulting case, and the name of the case, which I have there, is Athaide versus Olin Chemicals. Olin Chemicals makes turtle wax. So in that case, we had to do the jury selection. Jury selection is all empirical, all research. So what we do in those cases is look to see who the best juror would be to have to hear that case. So in those situations, one of the things that we did was we took the transcript of the trial, every single thing that anyone said, both the defense and the prosecution, about the case. We took every single piece of evidence, and myself and the professors at a law school and the forensic psych professors evaluated every single piece of evidence along 3 dimensions: probative, non-probative, and extra evidentiary. A probative piece of evidence is how relevant the evidence is to the heart of the case. Non-probative is it's less relevant, and extra evidentiary is like, look, I like that attorney's suit. Okay, it doesn't really matter. That has no bearing on the evidence. And so we rated every single piece of evidence, and we wanted to see what the jurors used when making their decisions. It's strictly cognitive psychology, it's strictly empirical science, it's advanced statistical analysis. But that's how that works out. I mean, we have to evaluate every single piece of evidence to show how jurors are making decisions. And that was a really good case. What happened was Olin Chemical Companies, they make things like turtle wax, things like that. They had a factory along the Ohio River, and they had effluent or chemicals that they were discharging into the river, and people downstream were drinking the water and bathing in it and things like that, and they became ill. That is a toxic tort. That's my favorite area of psychology. So what we had to do was evaluate the evidence in the case to see what juror was most favorable. Yes, now my neighbors decide to mow the lawn when I'm making a video. Oh my God. Anyway, so we used that, and we picked the jurors that we thought would be the best cognitive processors of the evidence. And that's how we got to not shape, but assist in the jury selection in those kinds of cases. And some of the times the evidence is just very complex and overwhelming. My famous example is I had a grandmother in the research panel, and they're listening to the case, and she says, I said, well, what did you think of the epidemiologist's testimony? We had a physician who was an epidemiologist, and he was testifying about T cells and T helper cells and T suppressor cells and the effects of the chemical that they were dumping on the body. And she looked at me and she said, honey, his words just came out of his mouth like bullets. In other words, she didn't understand what he was saying. She understood that it was important, but she didn't really understand the evidence. So that's important for us to know when we're trying to get a fair trial. You don't want a trial to be heard by people who don't understand the evidence that's presented to them. So that's another way that we use empiricism or research psychology in psychology and law. So this is part 2. We're going on to part 3, and I'll continue with this paper. I'm going to stop this here.